Okay, so I think we will get started. We have almost 150 attendees now joining us. Again, my sincere apologies for the technical difficulties with that link. Hopefully those of you who wanted to join us were able to do so, but again, this presentation is being recorded, so it will be available later on, posted on our website. So thanks for your patience with us. So more formally, I'd like to welcome you to this live session for applying for graduate scholarships, insider academic advice featuring tips and suggestions from Professor Jeff Casello, who is our Associate Vice President, Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs, and he's also the chair of our Institutional Scholarship Selection Committee. So again, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Heidi Musser, and I'm the Associate Director of Graduate Financial Aid and Awards in Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs, and I'm also your moderator for this presentation. Before we begin, I'll just give a brief introduction about this live session. We've designed this session because we recognize the importance of ensuring our students are set up for success with applying for graduate scholarships. This session is to give you important information preparing your scholarship application, especially focusing on your research proposal, how to select and who will write your reference letters, the importance of publications and academic contributions, how special circumstances may or may not impact your application, the institutional review and adjudication process, as well as other available resources to support your application. So during Jeff's presentation, we do encourage you to ask any academic related questions you may have. You can ask these questions by typing your question in the live Q&A section shown in the top right corner of your screen with a bubble that has a question mark in it. Assisting us behind the scenes during this presentation are my colleagues, Professor Liz Nilsson, who is one of our assistant VPs of Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs, who will respond to some of your academic related questions. And although this presentation is focused primarily on the academic side of applying for these scholarships, we do have Elena Machado and Laura Frizzy, who are part of my team, and they manage the scholarship competitions in grad studies. And they are joining us today, and they will respond to any administrative questions that you may happen to ask, even though the focus really should be on academic related questions. At the end of Jeff's presentation, we'll take some time to address some key questions that have arisen so that the entire audience can benefit. If you do happen to have administrative type questions about the application process itself for any of the competitions, we'll be having 2-hour live chat sessions this week, starting tomorrow from 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock, and then on the 17th, which is Friday, from 1 to 3, where my team and I will be happy to assist you. If you require closed captioning, please click on the CC icon on the bottom right corner of your screen and turn it on for the presentation. Also, we are recording this presentation and it will be available on our website within a few days in case you wish to revisit any of the content presented here today. And lastly, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the six nations that include 6 miles on each of the Grand River. Our active work toward reconciliation takes place across our campuses through learning, research, and community building, and is centralized within our Indigenous Initiatives Office. So at this point, and without further delay, I'll turn things over to you, Jeff.
Thanks so much, Heidi, and thanks to everyone for being here. It's really exciting for me to watch the number of attendees climb. Before I switch over and share my slides and get into the content today, I just want to make a couple of comments about the value of applying for scholarships. I think all of us understand that financing your education is a challenge for so many of our graduate students. And if you have the opportunity, of course, to receive external funding, that can reduce one of the major barriers to your education. So that's obviously a critical consideration. But if you are a research-based student particularly, then I think one of the things that you probably may not have a really firm grasp of is how valuable particularly holding tri-agency or OGS grants are. If you are a master's student or planning on being a master's student, for example, and you are successful in this scholarship process, that actually heightens your likelihood of being successful, I think, at the next stage for a PhD student. It certainly helps your overall CV in ways that I think students don't always understand the value of. So I really want to encourage you to take the steps to apply for these scholarships. They can be transformative, again, not just in the way that you fund your education, but also in the way it supports your overall CV. And selfishly, I can say that the university also derives a value from having more of its students holding these tri-agency awards. So really strongly encourage you to think about these awards and your competitiveness for them. So today I'm just really thrilled to be here to have an opportunity to walk through with you what we think are the key elements of being successful for this for these scholarship competitions. So I'm sharing my slides now, and I hope that you're able to see them. If my colleagues who are joining us can let me know that if you can't see them, I'll be grateful, but otherwise I will begin. All set, Heidi? Okay, thank you very much. And let me also apologize for the delays that we had in terms of getting things started. Sometimes technology and the university disagree, so I apologize for that. Okay, what will I be talking about? Just in the way of format, I'm going to go through these slides. I've got about, I think about 15 or so slides to talk through today. I'm going to cover some key elements of what is contained in the processes, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. I know that there are questions already coming in, and my colleagues Liz and Elena and Laura and Heidi are behind the scenes answering questions as they come in, as they're able. But the ones that are probably best suited for me to answer, we'll hold on to those, and we'll get a chance to answer all of those at the end of our session this afternoon. So with that, let me begin. And this is what we'll talk about today. We'll talk about the research proposals, so the core content that you're including in your application, who you should choose for referees and what instructions you should give them. How do you actually document your publications and your contributions? I was scanning the Q&A and I saw that there was a question about someone who doesn't have a lot of publications but feels that they have a lot of contributions, and I'm happy to address that issue directly. Some of you will have special circumstances. That normally means that there's been some kind of interruption or some kind of unexpected influence on your academics that you wish to make the adjudication committees, both at the university and at the national level, aware of, and we'll give you some guidance on when and in what circumstances and how to present that information as well. Then I'll talk to you a little bit about what our committee does, the committee that I'm fortunate to chair, and so we'll talk about how we evaluate things. We'll also point you to some resources that are available on the campus that we think are useful for you in preparing your scholarship applications. And then, as I said, we'll open things up for questions and answers. So with that, let me get started. So when you start on your research proposal, remember what you're trying to do here is you're trying to give the audience a really good understanding of what it is you're going to do if your scholarship application is successful. And there's some just general advice that I like to give to all of the applicants. And I should just begin by saying that I've read probably thousands of these applications over the last 5 years. I think thousands is a correct number. And so I can tell you that one of the deciding factors, really, and this is maybe surprising, but really one of the deciding factors is the ease in which one can gather the information that the applicant wants the reader to get. So it's really important that you lay out and you work diligently to make sure that your information that you're providing to the committees is as available as it possibly can be. So to that, one simple bit of advice is to use subheadings. So when you start to write your research proposal, if you have 4 pages of very dense, single-spaced, no-break text, it's really hard on the reader to gather, again, all the information that you want. But if you help and tell a little bit of a narrative and you use these subheadings to structure things effectively, it makes reading that proposal much easier. So I strongly suggest using subheadings. If you have an image that can be really effective, if an image really can save you 1,000 words in your research proposal, by all means use it. One tendency we've seen recently is for students to put really complex and well, I would say ineffective images in their proposals. The images that students are using have such detail and require such a level of understanding. What they really do is you add the image and then you need 2,000 words to explain that image. So I think images are great when they tell a really good story, but tell it at the level of expectation of the reader. So just be careful with that. When you're writing, this is a real skill that it takes some time to gather that. To just be as concise as you can without leaving out the important details. So there's always this balance of wanting to tell the reader too much about what you're wanting to do, and then you go and you don't tell them enough about what you want to do. So the balance is so that the reader can really understand what it is you're going to do without getting into really the weeds of what it is you're going to do. So I study public transportation. My last NSERC grant was about trying to model sustainable transportation, and I talked a lot about behavioral models in my proposal. Now, I didn't get into in great detail the parameters of equations and what the ranges of those things are, because that was too much detail for the reader. But I hope that I was able to provide the reader with enough detail to understand exactly what it was I was going to do. One thing that we often see is acronyms and jargon. Now, you have to understand that the people who are reading your application have a reasonable amount of scientific knowledge. If you define an acronym and then you use it regularly, that's certainly fine. But if the entire proposal is filled full of acronyms and jargon that I, as a reasonably well-informed reader, doesn't know what they mean, then it's not going to be a very effective application. So try to avoid those, or at best, use acronyms and jargon effectively and make sure you define them well as you're talking through or as you're writing through your proposal. We often use the conditional students tend to use the conditional, so I would like to, I would, and what would means is there's a certain set of conditions where you'll do it, and then there's a certain set of conditions where you won't. And I don't think that's what you want to present to your reader. You have to be definitive and say that when you are successful, you will do this, and you will conduct this research, and you will access this data set, and you will interact with these human participants, and so on. So be forward and be confident that you're going to be successful, and write in that first person and say that you will do that. One very simple thing is to avoid spelling and grammar mistakes. If you think about being at the national level and you're getting hundreds of these applications to adjudicate, and all of the students are really strong, if there is an application that comes with poor grammar or poor spelling, I think that's sort of an easy way to exclude that applicant. So regardless of how good the rest of your application is, if you have typos, if you have spelling errors, if you have grammatical mistakes, if you have punctuation mistakes, those can be very much red flags for your application, both at the university and moving forward to the national competition. So I hope that general advice is helpful. Let's move into some more specific things on your research proposal. So when you are writing your proposal, I think that there is two really important things. One is you have to tell us not only what you intend to do, but how you intend to do that. So again, if you are going to do something and it requires human participants, you have to give the reader confidence that you will be able to access those human participants. If your work requires access to rare annals in libraries, you have to tell us that you're going to have that access. So we have to have a confidence that you're going to actually be able to do the work that you're going to be able to do. But maybe the most important thing, and this is the part that I think so many students miss, is we really have to know what is the impact of your work. Why is this important to society, to Canada, to the economy, to the environment, to one of the global problems, to health? Those are really good examples. We were just looking at postdoctoral applications for a really prestigious scholarship, and one of the postdocs applications started out by saying that they were going to develop a new imaging system that has the potential to diagnose and identify cancer cells. And of course, that's enormously impactful to the reader, that if this is what the work is going to do. Then that candidate never mentioned it again throughout their entire proposal. So that's a mistake. The key thing is that you are able to talk to us about why your work is important, how you're actually going to structure and do it, and what are the impacts of that work once you're done. Those are really the three things that I think I would encourage you to concentrate on as you're writing your proposal. Normally I talk about the writing process as kind of a martini glass, and if any of you have drank a martini, you know that the martini glass starts with a very wide top. So that's the big problem, that's the big area that you're trying to work on, and then you narrowly lead the reader down into the stem of the martini glass, and that's where you talk about the specific research that you're going to do. So make sure you take us on that narrative from the big picture, again, sustainability, health, economies, poverty eradication, those kinds of big picture questions, and then bring us narrowly into exactly what your research is. And again, if you know what a martini glass looks like, the bottom of that martini glass has a big bottom, a big base. And the idea there is that you take the work that you've done in the stem and then you expand it back out to the big problem. So start with the big problem, walk us down to your specific work, how you'll do it, and then at the bottom tell us about the impact. That's the key structure, I think, of writing a successful research proposal. And if you need help with your overarching writing structure, the Writing and Communication Center is a phenomenal resource. I strongly suggest that you be in touch with them. If English isn't your first language, then again, write out your ideas, make sure that the ideas flow, try to get them in as good a form as you can, and then be sure to engage native English speakers in your writing, because again, some awkward language in your proposal can be problematic for the readers. So it's really important that you have a chance to have your work vetted by someone, again, who is a native English speaker. One thing that we ask for you not to overlook is the lay abstract. So this feels like an add-on at the end of the process, but it's really important for you to get the reader's attention very early. So start with a really powerful lay abstract. And again, the lay abstract should be just that. What a lay abstract means is that someone who has very little academic background, very little science or humanities or social sciences or technology background can pick up your lay abstract and again, know what you're going to do and know what the impact of that is. So don't overlook the lay abstract. Super important, spend some time on it. And falling back on the point I was making previously about having others read your work, it's super important to get someone both in your discipline, your supervisor, your colleagues, your peers, to read your proposal and just give you some honest feedback about whether or not the narrative works, whether or not the story flows, whether or not things make sense. And if that's the case, fantastic. And if not, then there's an opportunity for you to revise. But it's also important for you to get someone who is much less tied into your discipline to read your work, because they're the ones who can actually give you some important feedback on whether or not your storytelling works. And remember, storytelling is a really important part of writing a successful proposal. So I think that's the most important elements on the research proposal. Again, I hope that's helpful for you. There will be times, of course, to ask some questions and answers at the end of the presentation. Okay, let's move forward and talk about your referees. Each scholarship that we run, whether it's NSERC, SSHRC, CIHR, or other specific scholarships, are clear about who can be your reference and what that reference is going to serve. So sometimes for these scholarships, well, nearly always, there is a need for someone to comment on the strength of your academics, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. There may also be some value in asking people to talk about work that you've done outside of the academy, outside of the university, if it reinforces some important story or some important messages that you'd like to send about yourself and the strength of your work inside the university. And I'll come back to that in just one second. So if you're choosing a referee, it's obviously important to choose someone who knows you well. So if someone was your supervisor for a couple of years and when you were working as an undergraduate research assistant, that's fantastic. If there was a person whose courses you've taken several courses and been really successful and maybe had conversations with them about your academic and professional goals, again, a really excellent candidate. What tend not to be really strong reference letters are colleagues who may have taught you once in a second-year course with 200 students, because they don't really get a chance to know you reasonably well. And part of the vetting that we look at when we look at reference letters is do we have really a confidence that the person who's writing this reference letter for you knows you well and can actually assess your academic strength? So it's important that you choose the right person. So let me tell you a bit about what we recommend in terms of how you engage that person. The first thing is, of course, to engage them early. The more time you give a potential referee, the more likely you are to have those people say yes to your request. The other thing is to make sure that you give them the information that they need in order to write for you a really good reference letter. So beyond your transcripts, beyond your CV, if a writing sample might be useful for them, of course you can remind them of how you knew each other and that you took 2 courses with them and so on. That's also helpful. But if there are elements that you want them to reinforce in your letter, then you should make that abundantly clear to them. So if you've done something that is really evidence of really good leadership or mentorship, you could share that with them. One of the things that I often ask students who ask me for a reference letter to do is I ask them to send me 5 to 10 things about themselves that I wouldn't know, that I don't know, but I should know about them. So for example, if some of my students are fluent in multiple languages, if some of my students are active in their church or in their place of worship, if some of my students hike or travel, I want to know those things so I can sort of work that into the narrative as I write their reference letters, so that it can really demonstrate to the reader that I know them really well. And so that's a good advice, I think, for students if you are reaching out to give your referees not only your basics, your academics, your transcript, potentially a writing sample, but talk to them about the things that you think are most important for them to emphasize in their letter, and then share with them something personal about yourself. So again, that they can work that into their reference letter so it demonstrates how well they know you. Deadlines are important. I think all of us as faculty members or as letter writers often want to be reminded and make sure that we meet deadlines. So don't hesitate to send reminding emails. Do it politely, of course. And I think there's an important point on the slide here to always say thank you. It's not an insignificant task to write a reference letter. I think for most of us, we love to do it because we are reinforcing our really strong students and trying to support them as they grow. But it's always nice to get a thank you note from our students when we've done that for them. So let me just say one more thing about the referees. If you have a professional referee, it's important that they talk about you in that professional setting. Obviously, were you productive at work? Did you show leadership? Did you take initiative? Those kinds of things. But if there is the possibility for them to link your professional experiences back to your field of study, that's always helpful as well. So if, for example, you were working at a hospital as part of a co-op term or as an internship, and the work that you were doing in the hospital is directly related to the research work that you're going to be doing or you're proposing to do for the scholarship, that linkage between your professional referee and the work that you're going to be doing, super important and can really add value. One of the things I dissuade against is, and some colleagues disagree with me, so you can take this and you can feel free to disregard this comment, but sometimes I feel like if you are a new master's student or a brand new PhD student working with a supervisor, and that supervisor writes your letter of reference and you've known each other for just a couple of months, it feels disingenuous to me that someone would write to say that you're the best student they've ever worked with when they've only worked with you for a month or two. So you might consider looking backwards more so than looking forward when you're asking for referee letters. So again, I hope that that guidance on referee package is helpful for you. Talking now about publications, we certainly understand that when we read a application from someone who is in a STEM discipline where there is a really active lab and you've been part of that, there's a likelihood that you're going to have a really large number of referee journal publications. We also know that if you're working in the humanities and you're working on a single authored manuscript, it can take a much longer time to get that manuscript out, and there isn't going to be the same level of journal publications and so on. So I think the important thing is that when you talk about what you've contributed and what you've published, we're able to situate the strength of your record relative to other people in our pool and relative to other students. And so if, for example, your work is largely community-based and you have only 1 or 2 journal articles, but you have been in front of a dozen municipal councils, or you have talked to Parliament, or you have provided insight, policy insight on other government agencies. Those kinds of things are incredibly impactful, and they have to be in your CV, and they have to be identified as your contributions. So this is not at all a bean counting exercise. What we are really looking to see is whether or not you as a student have been able to take the work that you've done and use it to be impactful outside of the academy. Now, certainly that doesn't diminish the value of peer-reviewed publications. Certainly those are important. Conferences are important, but the other things are also really important. One thing that is important for you to do is to differentiate between peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed journals. So if you write something that goes into a really high-profile outlet like a journal like Nature, for example, that's obviously evidence of really strong scholarship. If you write something for the National Post or for the Globe and Mail, that also can be really impactful. The former is peer-reviewed, the latter is not peer-reviewed. And that's important to differentiate because the peer review process tends to take longer, it tends to get more scrutiny and so on. So be sure you differentiate between those two. And again, it makes our review of the overall package of your application a little bit easier for us to do if it's clearly laid out when it is peer reviewed and when it's not. And I guess I've already talked a little bit about the professional experience, about why it's important to your performance, both in the past and in the future as an academic. Okay, as I mentioned at the top, there is an opportunity for students to talk to us about special circumstances. And again, what that normally would mean is there were times when something has occurred in your life that would have impacted your academic productivity, whether that means it influenced your marks, or it influenced your publication records, or it influenced your ability to conduct research and so on. What this section is really used for is to, as I said, if there were, suppose you were a master's student and you were conducting research and you were doing great in your academics, and then God forbid your mom fell ill and that required some of your attention for 3 or 6 months, and your academics suffered in that time period, or you left the university in that time period. It certainly would be fair for you to say in the special circumstances section, if this is what the competition allows, is to say that you were dealing with a family health emergency in that period, and that's what explains why there was that extraordinary, unusual level of performance in that period, okay? What we don't want to see in there are things that would potentially reflect negatively on you as a person or on the research environment. So if you and your supervisor didn't get along, if you were getting 92 in every one of your classes and then you got 91 or got 90 in a class, don't write in your special circumstances that the reason why you got 90 was because for whatever reason, because that is not going to draw the attention. The 92 to 90 change is not going to draw the attention of the review group. So don't draw attention to things that you don't need to draw attention to. Okay, so really use the special circumstances. I would say it's pretty rare that when we read the special circumstances, it's pretty rare that they get dealt with at all. But when we do see them, it's typically because there was something really substantive that is really helpful to explain a change in performance that the student wants us to understand. And just to be clear, there's no reason to share with anyone any kind of private information. So, you know, if you were dealing with a personal health emergency, that's certainly enough for you to say. We don't need to know what that health emergency was. And in fact, we don't want to know what that health emergency was. If there were family situations, that's enough to say that. So really be reserved and be thoughtful in your judgment about what you do share. There's no obligation to share anything more than to say that there was a situation that you were dealing with. And you know, you have to give us enough that we can understand what that was, whether it's health related, personal related, professional, whatever that was. But the details are absolutely not necessary and really should be avoided. Okay, so you may be wondering what happens, and the team behind me can answer more on the process questions, but I can tell you what happens when we receive the files. Our committee has regularly been made up of a group that I chair with 2 assistant vice presidents, Liz, who is behind the scenes with us today, and another colleague, Sean, who couldn't be with us today. Those are our assistant vice presidents from GSPA. There are 6 faculties at Waterloo, as you know. We have an associate dean, graduate studies in each of those faculties. And so what happens is in every competition, we read all of the applications that we receive, and the way it gets read is 1 person from inside your faculty and 1 person from outside of your faculty. And so if there were someone applying from engineering, the engineering graduate associate dean would read that, and then someone from outside of engineering, whether it would be me as associate vice president or one of the assistant vice presidents or one of the associate deans from one of the other faculties. And we do that for all the applications that we receive. We provide 2 scores, and then we do an assessment of the ranking of those applications. And if you're worried about inherent bias, if you're worried about inclusivity, if you're worried about the diverse lens through which we look at this, all of us have taken inherent bias training. And in the last year, we've moved towards purposefully comprising this committee of people with different lived experiences. So those of you who may be doing work on issues related to culture, race, heritage, if you are working on indigeneity, those kinds of things, you can trust that these things are being read with a lens by people who are well prepared to understand the nature of the kind of work that you're doing. And that's important to us as an institution in terms of our inclusivity. So what we do is once we get through those scores, we tend to have some really strong applications. They rise to the top. We have some applications, unfortunately, that are weaker. They move towards the bottom of our list. And then there is a kind of a midpoint of applications that we then come together as a group and we talk through. And we talk through many of them to decide who is admitted and who moves on to the national committee and who does not move on to the national committee. And I just want to assure you that it's something that all of us take enormously seriously. We do this over a couple of weeks. As I said, we read many of these applications, but we do so carefully and we do so thoughtfully. And when one of us has a score that is very different than the other, there is a really strong need for us to talk through that and to understand what caused that discrepancy. So I can also assure you that all of the members of this committee who are reading your work are being held accountable. I'll just maybe make a plea here on the last bullet point on this slide is to talk about the fact that we really do have limited time for each of the applications that we read. So if you are able to engage us, if you are able to make your work exciting, if you're able to get us enthusiastic about your work, that is going to improve the likelihood, well, improve the quality of your application. I'll just say it that way. So do try to think about that as you're writing. Again, don't bombard us with jargon and with details. But don't leave us wanting to understand fully what you're doing. Get that balance right and write in a way that generates, as I said, excitement around your work. Okay, so what's available to you for supporting you as you start down this path? We have been collecting really good examples of research proposals that we think were excellent, and so we have a SharePoint site there that is linked on these slides. You can visit that and you can read some sample proposals. We have a web page, or we have web pages that helps to provide guidance for each of the competitions, and you can see that link there. You're already attending a live chat, but there are more of them coming. I understand from Heidi and others that you'll have a chance to talk about process and procedures. As I mentioned before, the Writing and the Writing Communication Center, they are excellent resources, and they also hold a series of workshops that you can attend, so don't hesitate to reach out to the Writing and Communication Center. We have a group of people who we have worked with in the past who are competition experts. There's a link there to tell you who you might talk to and to get some guidance specifically on the work that you're proposing or on the proposal that you are drafting for the scholarship competitions. Here's our internal team. So you don't see them today, but this is the group. Heidi, you've met, and Elena, Laura, and Miranda are always eager to support the work of our colleagues and of our students. I can say this, and I'll compliment them. Honestly, I don't know that there is a group that I've ever had the opportunity to work with who are more committed to advancing our students' well-being and putting them in positions to be successful than this group of colleagues. They are just fantastic and dedicated to their job. If you have any questions at all, reach out on process. They will certainly be in touch and they will give you precisely the answer that you need to be successful. So please don't hesitate to reach out to the team. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll thank you for listening. I do hope that that was useful for you, and I am happy to take as many questions as there are that are of interest to the group. So Heidi, maybe back to you for moderation, and happy to, as I said, answer any questions students might have.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeff. That was very enlightening, very informative. I'm seeing some really positive feedback in the Q&A, so that's great. There are some questions. I'm trying to organize it by topic. Some questions about research proposals. So who are the readers that we should be targeting? Like, what is their familiarity with the subject matter?
Yeah, okay, great. So when we look at it internal to the university, the two readers are going to be someone from your faculty. So you know, I read, because I'm joint appointment in engineering and in environment, I read both applications from both units. And, you know, honestly, if something comes from planning or geography, those are areas I have a lot of confidence in. If they come from civil engineering, management science, sys design, I feel like I have a strength there. When we get into ECE or Chem Eng, I feel like I have a little bit less strength of understanding. But the key thing is, again, you have to get the balance right so that the person from your faculty who really knows your content should have a confidence that you're going to be able to do that. But the person who only knows a little bit about your work can also follow the logic of your proposal and also have a confidence that you can and will do the work and it will be impactful. So you should think about writing this. Maybe the right way to explain it is to say, suppose you were talking not to your grandmother, because that's not enough detail, but talking to a colleague of yours from another discipline at the same academic level as you are at the university. So if you're a PhD student in civil engineering, you should be talking about your procedure, your proposal in a bit more detail than a PhD student from computer science might need. I think that's the right balance. And remember that when you talk to that PhD student from outside of your discipline, you have to be able to walk them along and keep them up to date and keep them understanding your content.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff. I've got a few questions here about how to frame your research proposal when you've got past experience that has to do with industry. Maybe you've been out of academia for a while. And if you've been working in industry and have, you know, patents or whatnot, like how do you incorporate that into your application? Yeah,
super question. Again, what we're really looking for here is impact, colleagues. So if you were, for example, suppose you worked in a STEM discipline, suppose you were, I'll use a biology example, and you created, you know, from your undergrad and your master's degree, you went to work and at a private corporation or even in the public sector, you continued work related to your field and you did create patents. You created intellectual property that you then recorded. Even if your research work that you're coming back to now is a little bit different than what you had done professionally, the fact that you've patented intellectual property shows enormous leadership. It shows innovation. It shows a strength of capacity. And that's the way it should be presented. Even if it's not directly related to the work that you're going to do, you can look backwards and say, I've demonstrated my capacity to really develop new foundational knowledge through the creation of this intellectual property that I then went on to patent. And that's important that you tell us that because it does demonstrate, again, well, there are many attributes that we're looking for in strong applications. We're looking for innovation. We're looking for academic leadership. We're looking academic ability. We're looking at research capacity. And if you're doing those things in a professional setting, it's important that you tell us that that's what you've done. Okay, so don't be shy about that, including that, and that can be written as part within your research proposal, or it can be written. Sometimes you can suggest that your referees include that kind of observation in your reference letters. So just make sure it appears either in the proposal or through your referee letters, or however you can work it in. If there's an opportunity for you to provide your contributions explicitly, that's a place where you can work that in as well.
Thanks, Jeff. So I'm just going to read this one question here. Can you further discuss including an image in the proposal or provide links to examples? I've never seen this done, but I'm curious how I might include it. I'm in a field that includes research with participants. Could I include an image from my field work that shows participants, or would it be better to include images that don't show individuals to avoid potential issues with ethics?
Yeah, I would strongly recommend against images that have people in them. When I'm talking about images in your proposal, I'm talking about communication tools that allow you to explain at a reasonably high level what the content and what the context, so content and context of your work is going to be. So if there is a really nice synthesis of your research outline and the logic that you're following and the steps that you're taking, then including that is a really nice way to ground the reader in the steps that you're going to follow. And then you can write to each of those things without having to talk so much about the linkages, because the image will help you with that. If, for example, you are going to use a novel piece of equipment and you're actually designing some elements of that equipment, to understand conceptually how that equipment works and where you're targeting your own research is again really helpful. Imagine that you're building a fuel cell and you're working on the membrane where the catalyst lies, and something like that that helps the reader actually perceive what it is you're doing. That's what I'm strongly recommending. I don't think that that an image of, for example, a human participant research or those kinds of things. Here's a really good example. We had a candidate who was successful, I recall, whose work involved using images of meals with seniors, and the idea was that you could actually capture with recurring images how much food came off of that senior's plate, and that would give you a sense of how much the caloric intake was for that research participant. And so the idea of situating a camera over a meal and watching the change in the composition of the plate was really inherent in that person's research. And they included a sort of series of small images that showed full plate, less full plate, less full plate, empty plate, and without showing any of the people, but it demonstrated to us as a reader that this is what she was capturing. And it showed to us that this is the way in which she was going to capture caloric intake, and we got it. We got it clearly that that's what she was trying to do, and it was super effective.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to switch over to some questions about publications. Part of it has to do with, again, I think you spoke a bit about this. If you're in a different field that doesn't necessarily have a lot of opportunity to publish or do presentations, how do you address that? How do you capture the committee members' attention to that and make sure that they understand that? Or master's students who really don't have a lot of publications, how do they address that? Because how are they going to compare and fare against current PhD students, as an example?
Sure. Yeah, so I think it's important to recognize that we are comparing in pools, right, Heidi? We rarely will compare doctoral students to master's students. That's an unusual competition. And if we do, we often think about where they are in their programs, and we would have a different expectation about what the outputs might be. Similarly, if you are a second-year PhD student or even a third-year PhD student, we would expect a different level of output than if you are just beginning your PhD program. So I think it's important for our students to know that we always situate our expectations relative to where they are in their program. I would say that normally if you're an undergraduate student and you have done some research, it's fairly rare for an undergraduate student to have publications. They might have been part of a group that worked on something and maybe have one or potentially two publications that come out of their undergraduate research work. As a master's student, again, it's the norm that a master's student wouldn't have a whole lot of publications. But again, I think that the key thing that we're looking for is impact. So if you are, and impact isn't measured just by your publications. So if you're a master's student, you don't have any publications, but you have as part of your work, I'll give you another example. My own students worked, one of my students worked with Metrolinx on a project, and the project that Daniel did was to look at how Metrolinx might operate public transport systems in the Greater Toronto area if there weren't any municipal boundaries. And what Daniel ended up doing with his work was not only writing his master's thesis, but he also presented that to the board of Metrolinx. And on that board were mayors of many of the municipalities that were potentially affected by his research work. And that's not a publication at all, but it's enormously impactful translation of his work to output. And so I think that that's what we really need to see from our students, is to say that if your work engaged external partners in a meaningful way, other than the academy, that's what we want to learn about. So don't get hung up on numbers, don't get hung up on whether or not you have publications or not. Tell us about where you've been impactful. Even if you've worked for, just one more example, Heidi, quick, and then we'll get back to the questions. Suppose you were working with a senior graduate student, you as an undergraduate or as a junior graduate student, so maybe you're a master's student working with a PhD student, and as part of that PhD student's work, there needed to be some code that was written, or there needed to be a process that was developed, or there needed to be an interview that was done, and you took on that role, and your work ended up being a catalyst or a pathway for that senior graduate student to complete their work. Again, that's impactful, and it's super important that we hear that from the students.
Thanks, Jeff. Somebody's asking, again, because of the time that we're in over the last couple of years, they're wondering what extent COVID can be utilized as an extenuating circumstance. Should it be limited to research restrictions or any personal hurdles, family or childcare responsibilities?
Yeah, so thanks for that question, and we're super sensitive to that issue. I know so many of our graduate students have struggled with COVID. Well, so many of us have struggled with COVID, and not just limited to our graduate students. So I think that COVID is important to mention if the argument can be made that you were disproportionately affected by COVID. So, for example, if you were someone who would normally have gone out of province to do field work, and your field work wasn't possible during the COVID terms because of COVID-19. Well, I think a lot of people experienced that same delay. So I don't know that we would then, expect for a student to say, well, this completely disproportionately influenced me. You could certainly note that your research was delayed because of COVID, and everybody will understand that that's the case. Now, if you were disproportionately influenced, so I think, even at Waterloo, our colleagues who were trying to do human participant research, they were probably more influenced than the students whose work was in the labs, because we got back to lab work before we got to human participant research, just out of the nature of the safety requirements that were associated with both. So I think that's certainly worthwhile to talk about. If you had personal impacts that were associated with COVID-19 that would have disproportionately influenced you, suppose you are in a multi-generational household, you've got mom and dad living with you, and you've got your children living with you, and you had to be enormously cautious because of that multi-generational household construct, that's certainly reportable, and it's certainly something I would encourage students to tell us about, because that, again, is unique to that student and doesn't, I don't think, fall into the category of, yeah, but everybody suffered that same experience. Okay, so try to use your judgment about whether or not it is, again, unique to you, not necessarily unique, but unusual in your circumstances, and would have disproportionately influenced you as opposed to others.
Thanks, Jeff. Some questions about leadership and volunteering and whatnot. And do you have any examples of what would constitute academic leadership? We see a lot of applications where students will say that they've TA'd. Is that considered strong leadership examples, or, volunteering, instructing at nonprofit organizations? How much emphasis is put on leadership and volunteerism, and what are some examples?
Thanks for that question too. So again, when we review the applications, one of the things that we see is, you guys are an enormously talented group. In fact, Heidi will know this, that we had a faculty member just write us a little while ago to say, you know what, I don't know how you do this because all of these candidates are so incredibly strong. It's really difficult to differentiate. So one of the things that we do regularly use to differentiate is the evidence of leadership. And so let me give you some really good examples of what constitutes leadership in my perspective, and maybe there's others that people can share. One is certainly mentorship. So if you are a grad student and you and your supervisor collectively are looking after some undergraduate programs, that's fantastic. So if you're supporting a capstone project, that's really good evidence of academic leadership. If you are, for example, if you're TAing, that's certainly a nice bit of academic leadership. But if there's more evidence that you can provide on what you've done as a TA, so did you create a second tutorial section for those who are struggling? Did you meet in an off time to support those students who were struggling with particular assignments? Were you able to create a Facebook group in which students could share information that you moderated and facilitated? So those things that are beyond the sort of traditional requirements that show an additional kind of contribution to the success of others, that really demonstrates really good leadership. If you do things away from the university, if you volunteer, if you are reading to seniors, if you are playing piano in senior homes, if you are, again, engaged in your places of worship, if you're doing those kinds of things in a way that, again, demonstrates your commitment to social and cultural well-being and advancement of others, that is really good evidence of leadership. And we love to see those things. And I know that so many of our students are doing remarkable work in those settings. So tell us about it, and tell us about it in a way that, again, engages us. And, one thing that always resonates with me is when a student can link the things that they're doing away from the academy, away from the university, to what they want to do as a researcher. So maybe you were working at a homeless shelter and you became really interested in, again, nutritional well-being of those who are coming to the homeless shelter, and that in some part motivated your research. So if you make those linkages between things that are happening away from the university and things that are happening at the university, again, that shows great strength in great leadership. So I hope those examples are useful. Essentially, I think if I can boil it down really quickly is, if you say you volunteered, that's great. We'll be pleased to know that. But if you tell us that you volunteered and you took these additional steps, and these are some examples of what you've done, and this is how it links back to your own work, that's what I think is a really good articulation of leadership.
Thanks, Jeff. So there's been some, we know that artificial intelligence has been, one of our key target areas of research lately. So with the current interest that's available in CS, AI, and ML, does this affect the other fields of study? Is it difficult for other fields of study to get a scholarship if they're not related to those key areas?
Yeah, a very short answer is to say no, that we're looking for excellence, regardless of discipline, background, area of concentration. So the very short answer is no.
Okay. Somebody is saying, I'm in political science. How does an arts research proposal differ from, say, a science or engineering one? Sure.
So again, if I were thinking about, and I'll get all this wrong for my colleagues in political science, so forgive me, but I'm going to try and walk you through the way I would think about writing a proposal for a political science scholarship application. So if you're in political science, let's think, for example, that you're actually most concerned about the quality of discourse that's happening and about social engagement on that quality of discourse. So are people really understanding issues, and are they able to make good political choices in terms of their understanding of the issues? Maybe that's the big picture. And the bigger picture is that we're not often in a position to do that, and as a result, our democratic processes aren't working as well as we would like them to. So that's what I would think it would be, that top part of the martini glass. And then you would walk us down as to how other people have thought about that, how you might evaluate whether or not that's true, how you might be able to assess whether or not that's true. And then ultimately you would ask a research question, like to say, how can we better disseminate information so that people are well prepared to make good political decisions? And then you would, in the stem of that martini glass, walk us through the exact methods. Would it be a human participation? Would it be interviews? Would it be conversations with politicians? Would it be conversations with news media? Those kinds of things, really the details of what you wanted to do. And then at the bottom of that martini glass, you would tell us again, why is that going to be impactful? So when we know that, we're going to be able to develop better strategies to disseminate information. So we'll have more informed voters, and those who actually are selected to govern are going to be those who are representative of our communities. And that's the way I would perceive a political science. Now that may be, not what anyone in political science is thinking about, but I hope that the thought process there is clear. Start again with the big picture, walk us down to a narrower picture where you're defining specific questions, tell us what you're going to do in that picture, and then tell us when you're done why that's going to be important for us. That's not very different than what we're going to do in STEM, only the top picture might be different and the STEM is going to be different, but the method is the same. So I hope that's helpful for our colleagues looking at arts, preparing an art scholarship application.
That's great. Thank you, Jeff. I'll just give you a moment to catch your breath, have a drink
Thank you.
of water. I will just, I just thought I would share a few stats just for interest's sake. So as we know, these competitions, they are very competitive. We do get a lot of applications for these. So I'm just going to give some quick stats based on last year's competition, since those are over and done with. For CIHR, that's the medical field. Last year for the masters, our quota was 5. So we could award 5 of those. We received 29 applications. For the doctoral, our quota was 11 and we received 32 applications. For the NSERC Masters last year, our quota was 58 and we received 278 applications. For the doctoral, the quota was 142 and we received 144 applications. So we received, just above our quota in terms of the number of applications. For SHRC, the master's quota was 38 and we received 135. And then for the doctoral, the quota was 41 and we received 138. So for the doctoral, the NSERC and SHRC doctoral, our success rate is almost about 50%. So based on our quota, what we're allowed to send forward, our success rate is usually close to 50%. We're in the top 3 or 4 in terms of our competitor, our peer institutions across Canada. So we do actually very well with NSERC, so that's great. In terms of the Ontario Graduate Scholarship, unfortunately, we don't have the quotas yet for this year, but last year our quota was about 200 and we receive, I would say, over 1,000 applications for the Ontario Graduate Scholarship alone. Of our quota, which is, like I said, about 200, 5 of those can go to international students. So it is very competitive. The OGS is not transferable. You have to apply for it at the institution where you want to hold it. I did see a question in the Q&A about if a student is interested in pursuing a doctoral program at another institution, do they apply for that NSERC doctoral through Waterloo? The answer would be yes, if they have been registered at Waterloo within this last calendar year or current calendar year. So that's just a few stats I thought I would share just for interest's sake. So Jeff, sorry, did you have a comment about that?
No, I wanted to answer one of the questions as I was scanning through while you were chatting, Heidi. There was, and this is a really important one, and I want to make sure I get to it. So there's a couple of students who have asked about doing theoretical work, and I keep emphasizing impact. And it's a very fair question to ask. if I'm doing theoretical physics, if I'm doing theoretical mathematics, how do I actually talk about the benefits to society, right? And so I wanted to address that if I can. I think the key thing is for those of you who are doing really theoretical work is to again situate your work in the bigger picture and to say, this may or may not be true, but suppose you're doing theoretical physics and you're looking at our understanding of the universe, and you are really working again on fundamental theories that that don't translate to anything that is going to be implemented in the next year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. But what's important is that the science that you're doing or the mathematics that you're doing or the philosophy that you're considering is going to ultimately be impactful. So if we have a better understanding of the universe, if we have a better mathematical representation of complex functions that in the very long term might allow us to solve more complex math problems that would ultimately have some benefit in different disciplines, help us make those linkages, right? Even if it's very indirect, even if it could be a decade from now, even if it might never come to fruition, I think it's still important for us to be able to understand why you were motivated by this, why you were curious about it, and in the longest term, what might be the implications. I'll just give you a really quick example on that. I have a colleague at the University of Toronto who has been working on doing travel forecasting models. So this is trying to predict where and when and how people will travel. And 2 decades ago, he started down a completely different path than everybody else. And I think his work at the time, it would have been very difficult to convince practitioners or society that there was going to be value in his work. But 20 years on, his work is foundational now for the way that we're doing the science and we're doing the engineering and we're doing the planning that his work ultimately informed. So just try and help us make that link. You know, again, when I read pure math, when I read the physics applications, I get it that there's going to be less connection between that and impact immediately. But don't leave us without any understanding of exactly where your work is going to potentially have impact. So I wanted to address that, Heidi.
That's great. Thank you for adding that. Some of the application requirements now have that students need to include equity, diversity, and inclusion statements in their research proposal. Do you have any suggestions as to how they can do that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think the key element is really about thoughtfulness. I think for too long we have allowed the research in the academic enterprise to take place without really understanding how it might impact disadvantaged societies, or maybe more importantly, how we might include disadvantaged or equity deserving groups in ways that would actually advance their well-being. So let me just give you some examples that I think are relevant. Suppose you are doing work on water quality, and that work on water quality might have application to improving the access to clean water for indigenous societies, certainly really important. If you're talking about food regulation, and again, if that might help in inner cities where we have disproportionately low income people who are going to potentially benefit from better nutritional information, super important. If your research is going to engage members of the community who are disproportionately from Black, Indigenous, persons of color, and so on, important that you acknowledge that, thoughtful about your participant selection, be direct about how that's going to be handled, and about how well prepared you are as a researcher to be able to deal with that situation successfully, thoughtfully, carefully, professionally, and so on. So two really, maybe three really important things to think about. One is, does your work have applications to those who are equity deserving? Second is, will your work interact with those who are equity deserving? And if that's the case, then the third element is, how are you preparing for that, both in terms of your specific research elements, but you personally, to make sure that you are well prepared to be inclusive in your approach and in your thoughtfulness to doing the research that you're proposing.
Thanks, Jeff. Somebody's asking, I'm going to be close to the deadline for how long into the PhD before I can no longer apply. So they're concerned about they are eligible to apply, but they're just wondering about whether their application will be reviewed differently because they're further along in their PhD, and is preference given to students who are just starting out?
Two thoughts. One is there's no guideline, there's no strict rules about to say that, you know, if you're in year 3, then we think about your application this way, as opposed to someone who is in year 0 of their PhD. So the short answer is no. The longer answer is that, of course, you know, if there were 2 candidates and both had 4 or 5 impactful outputs from their research, and one was in year 0 and the other was in year 3, the university might look to say that this person has demonstrated greater research potential because they've accomplished this earlier in their process than later. That's not to say that if someone were from 2 different disciplines and had different publication records or different outputs, it would be the case. So I know that probably sounded like mixed messages. I just want to be clear that we're not by formula excluding PhD students who are further along, but we are looking for evidence of research capacity that should be commensurate with where you are in your program. Maybe I'll just give maybe a better example to say that if you're getting to the end of your eligibility window, then we would expect, I think, a much more well-defined research proposal, because at that point in your PhD career, you should have that ready. And if you're in year 0, just entering into your PhD program, a little bit less specificity in your research proposal might be expected from the readers.
Great, thank you. So getting quite a few concerned questions about, you know, again, where students are in their program, if they're just starting out and, you know, if they have basically 0 publications, what should we include and emphasize on to make our applications impactful and stand out? Somebody's saying, I'm assuming that a really good research proposal may not be enough since the competition is tough.
Yeah, so I'm sorry if I've overemphasized contributions and impact. I don't mean to do that. A really important element of these scholarship applications is, of course, research potential. And there's really good ways to demonstrate your research potential. Your academic background is one way to demonstrate your research potential, particularly if you've taken courses that require independent exploration. If at the undergraduate level you've written research papers for upper year undergraduate courses that have been really well received by your faculty members, by the instructor, that demonstrates the capacity to do research. So don't worry about publications in that setting. If you have worked with faculty members on problems, if you've taken on unique initiatives in your co-op experience, again, that demonstrates research potential. And that's what we're looking for. If you write a really good research proposal, of course, that demonstrates your potential to do really good research. And so all of those things summatively are the way that we evaluate your potential for research. And contributions, whether they're publications or otherwise, are just one element of those things. So all of those things, I think, are equally weighted. Evidence from other academic elements that are related to research, things that you've done professionally that demonstrate that you can identify a problem and solve that problem with impact on the output. If you have been involved in more formal academic research, great to talk about that. And if you have a research proposal that is motivating you to be part of the scholarship application process. So those 4 things together, as well as your outputs, are the way that we vet your research potential. So don't get hung up on the contributions. They're nice, but they're one part of an overall picture.
Okay, and so as an example, would a research internship be equivalent, you know, in some way as a publication?
Absolutely, yes. Suppose you were working as an undergraduate and you went to work at Grand River Hospital, and there you got curious about some process that you observed, or a patient's well-being, or even something on the technical equipment they were using, and you thought a lot about that, and that's what motivated your research proposal. Again, that demonstrates a curiosity. It demonstrates an ability to look at a very kind of complex problem and distill it down to something that captures your interest. And that's what research is about. So maybe that might be the most important message for our listeners to take away today. When we are thinking about your ability to do research, what we want to be able to know from you is that there's something happening that is really of interest to you. And you've looked at this complex thing that's happening, whether it's political science, whether it's medical devices, whether it's water quality, whether it is the works of Shakespeare, all of those things. There's a lot of complexity in those things, and there's something that's happening there that's really of interest to you. And what you're able to do is you're able to say, out of that really complicated and complex picture, this is the part that I'm really most interested about, and this is how I can articulate that, and this is how I'm going to address it, and this is why I think I'm going to be able to make an impact. And so it doesn't matter that if you've published those things, it's your ability to demonstrate that curiosity, translate that curiosity to something that can be applied, and then do the work and show its impact. So that's the core message that I want people to take away in terms of their research proposal.
I think that's fantastic. Thanks, Jeff, because I know that, sitting around the committee tables with you and the 6 associate deans and 2 AVPs, it's come up where, as an example, if you need to read a proposal that's from a student in pure math, it's like, oh my gosh, well, how do I make heads or tails of this? And you try to review it and see what is the student really honing in on, and what is the advancement to knowledge or whatnot. So I think this is the key, right? To really try and demonstrate, zone in on what is of interest and what the impact is. And I think if students really struggle with that, I would encourage them to also speak to their supervisors, right? And their grad officers or associate chairs, peer colleague review, get them to look at it and see, is the point really coming through in my research proposal, right?
Yeah, I think now you can imagine talking with your grandparents about this and before they surrender and just say, you know what, I don't know what you're doing. Actually get them to the point where they have some kind of understanding of why you're excited about the work that you're doing. I think that's what we have to be able to see, because if you can't convey your excitement for what you're doing to us, then it's going to be really hard for us to find your excitement in the proposal.
And I think students can learn a lot too by revisiting the grad flicks, or even like the 3MT that we were doing, to see like your elevator speech. What is it? What can you, what are you researching? What is driving your passion in this field of academia that, you really want to elevate and convey to others? So thank you for that. A student is asking, if the research I did in my undergrad is in a different area as what I'm working on now, how should I try to incorporate that into my application?
Yeah, great question. I think the key thing is when we do research, there's 2 things that happen. Of course, we research the information that we're interested in, the topic we're interested in, but we also learn about exploration. We learn about how to construct a problem, how to define a problem, how to approach a problem. And if you studied Shakespeare as an undergraduate and you were interested in the portrayal of women in Shakespeare as an undergraduate, and now you're talking about spike proteins on coronaviruses as a graduate student. Remarkably, I feel like those 2 processes don't need to be completely different. There still is complexity, there still is a hard problem, there still is lots of complications, and you have to work out how it is you're going to hone in and define some manageable element of that discussion that you want, and you have to tell us again why you're excited by that and what's going to be the impact. So don't hesitate to share with us that you conducted research in a different discipline as an undergraduate. Tell us how that helped you think about the problem that you will talk about as a graduate student. Tell us how that will help you think about the constructs and the approaches that you're going to take, what you learned from that process. Did you even make mistakes? Did you do something that ultimately limited your ability to draw the conclusions that you wanted? Because that self-reflection, looking back, is also a really valuable point to demonstrate that you've learned from your research experiences and that you're going to be in a really good position to be successful going forward.
Thank you, Jeff. Somebody is saying, thank you for the suggestions about the referees. Just wondering if it's okay to share personal side of pursuit with my academic referees. Does this fit with the ultimate goal of applying for research funding? For example, being actively learning a new language, artistic level, dance, music, photography, personal interests. How would these be worked into a funding reference?
Yeah, so again, I'll share my own personal experience as a referee and as someone who's written letters. So one of my PhD students now is applying for a prestigious postdoctoral fellowship. And when I write about him, I'm going to talk about, certainly I'll talk about his research outputs. I'll talk about the work we did together. I'll talk about the way he defined his research problem, about his approach, about how he accessed data, all those things that you would expect a referee to write about. But what I'll also talk about is that when he was working for me as a TA, I was teaching a 500-person course, and he said, look, we've got 10 TAs and they're operating independently and I need to get them organized. And so he began to run a session each week where he got the 10 TAs together and they talked about how they're going to mark and how they're going to solve problems and what they're going to talk about, and that demonstrated leadership. The other thing I'll talk about is how he is of one heritage. I also know that his wife is of another heritage. I know that they've had a child since they've been together in Canada. I know that they've experienced some health challenges with their parents remotely and how that's influenced their ability to be productive academically. But I'll also talk about him as the character that he demonstrated throughout those processes. And you know, the things that I know about him, that he is now learning his wife's language because he wants his daughter to be able to speak both his native language, her native language, and English, and you know, the efforts that he's going through. And that really will do two things, I think. I think it paints a really nice picture of my student, so the people who are reading my reference letter will get that sense. But it also gives me tremendous credibility as a referee, because if I know those things and I've shared those experiences with my student, then I'm in a really good place to evaluate his academic competencies. So by all means, have a conversation with your referee, talk to them about yourself, let them know what you want. I mean, as much as you feel comfortable sharing. I'm not telling you to, to share with them things that that you don't feel comfortable sharing. But I do think the more that you have a strong tie with your referee, the stronger the strength of your reference will go up, because there'll be evidence that you really are close with the person who's providing that reference for you.
Thank you. Does the university collect information on the racial and ethnic distribution of successful applicants to ensure equity?
We have not, I think, Heidi, right?
That is correct. We do not.
But what we do is at the end of our adjudication process, we do, for those that we know, we do look at gender and we do look at faculty distribution. And those are data that we review at the end of each process.
I mean, at this point, there's actually not really like a checkbox either on the application to say whether you identify as a particular ethnicity or not. I don't know if the tri-agencies are going to change that or not. Yeah, time will tell. We haven't heard about any of that at our regional meeting. So at this point in time, we do not collect information like that. Another question here. If I was successfully micro-supervising students in the lab and got wonderful feedback from them, can I include citations from this feedback to my application? Will it be valid?
In that case, I think certainly you should include that, but I would think that maybe the right way to include that is to have one of your referees. If there was a faculty member who was overseeing your supervision of the others, to include that in the reference letter to say that, that they received feedback that said that you were spectacular and that you really advanced their learning. That'd be great to be in a reference letter. I think, without getting the permission of the person who provided that feedback to you, including that as an actual quote in your own writing might not seem. I just think it would be better coming from a referee if that's possible. I wouldn't, if that's not possible, you could include it yourself, but it feels to me like that would be best from a referee.
Great. Regarding the EDI statement in the application, how would you talk about this when your project is based on data that is already collected?
Yeah, so I think you just have to be honest about that, to say that if at the time the data were collected that there was a concern for EDI and it's possible to explore the EDI implications of the data that you have, that's great. And if the data come to you from a time, if the data that you're receiving don't have that disaggregate information, then again, I think if you can at least identify that this is something that you're thinking about, it demonstrates your thoughtfulness. And so even if you're limited, you say, I don't have ethnicity data, I don't have that kind of information, so I can't specifically address it, but I acknowledge that my work could, with that information, inform outcomes for equity deserving groups. I think that demonstrates your thoughtfulness and your inclusivity.
Okay. How can one use the experience of an international student as a strength? I've studied and worked in 3 countries now, and sometimes lack of continuity in education feels like a weakness.
I saw that question, and I was hoping that you would ask me that one, Heidi, because I think it's incredibly important. My colleagues are going to roll their eyes. They've all heard this story 1,000 times, but I'm going to share it with you. I shared an office in graduate school with a friend who came from East Germany, another friend who was Indian, and another friend who came from South Korea. And my experiences as a graduate student were completely informed by not only academically, but what I learned and personally how I interacted with those friends and colleagues. And that knowledge base and that understanding of how others learn and what are their cultural foundations and how do their belief sets and how do their ways of knowing, how is that informed by different cultural backgrounds? This is what makes international research, or the ability to attract and retain and bring international students from around the world and share that background, those philosophies. That's what makes research rich, and that's what makes the university community a special place. So if you have experience and if you have anecdotes from those experiences that you can translate into how you'll approach your thought process and approach your research and approach your problem solving, that makes your application, for me, incredibly strong. Last anecdote, and I'll be quiet, is to say that I stood in small streets in parts of East Germany that not many North American tourists would visit. And I saw communist housing, and I saw an Eastern Germany coming back to life because of its reunification with the West. And that now informs the way I think about cities whenever I visit a city. And that's exactly the kind of perspective that I think shows great depths of research and great depth of talent and understanding. So if you have those kinds of experience as an international student, share it with us.
Thank you. Sometimes we get asked questions from students about how far back they should go in terms of their accomplishments, their leadership skills or involvement or scholarships that they've received. You know, we've seen applications that have high school scholarships on them, and we're like, really, those might be too old. But what's your recommendation with that? Should they be focused just on post-secondary?
Yeah, so my advice is this, Heidi, that they should be, the distance you look back or the time you look back should be proportional to the magnitude of the award. So if you won the award for being the top high school mathematician in Canada in grade 11, tell us that, because that's an enormous award and it's worth looking back to that. If you won the top mathematics student in letters A through D in your high school, don't tell us that, because that's not as impactful. So really try to gauge whether or not the award that you're telling us about from some years ago is really going to catch the attention of the reviewer. And if it's a national level award, tell us that. If it's a provincial level award, you probably want to tell us that. If it's a local award or even a high school based award, that's probably less impactful, and you probably don't want to look that far back. So I think that's the way that the judgment that I would use.
Yep, that seems completely reasonable. Thank you, Jeff. As a PhD student who is just starting out, I'm still figuring out my research topic. Do you recommend that I wait to apply until my second year of PhD?
that's a conversation for you and your supervisor to have. I'll give some general guidance. I think the key thing is that if you were to apply now with some uncertainty in your research direction, you shouldn't write your application with that research uncertainty. You should write your research application as if you were certain on what the approach is going to be and why it's going to be impactful. And it's certainly okay to write that and then receive the award and then learn that your research is going to go in a slightly different direction. What I would strongly recommend against is applying now and writing your application with the understanding that it's uncertain. Don't present that uncertainty to us. If you feel like you can't write an application now that has the certainty, then waiting probably makes sense. But if you feel like you can write an application now that has the certainty, even if you're, you personally aren't 100% sure that's how things are going to work out, that's okay.
Okay. Back to references, asking whether it's just somebody that you took a course with. Is that somebody you should ask a reference for, or is it somebody that you've really, you know, say done an NSERC USRA with? I think that would be, you know, that kind of academic supervisor, that would be a great opportunity for a reference. But if you just took a course with them, really didn't do any research, and they might not have any idea about the research that you are doing, could you still ask them?
Yeah, so I think we have to acknowledge that there are some of our students who are really extroverted and they get to know their faculty members and they get engaged in things in research and they do those kinds of things. And then we have other students who are less extroverted and they are less likely to be really well known by their faculty members. And so for that latter group, it can be difficult to really try to identify someone who they feel like will know them very well. And so I have two suggestions. One is to, when you do reach out to potential referees, even if it's someone who just taught you in a course and you really haven't spent much time talking with them, remind that referee of something that you might have done in their course. So if you got 99 on their midterm, that's nice for you to remind them of. If you got 100 on the final, if you got an A on the paper, if you got comments from them that said that your essay was fantastic when you wrote about Orwellian futures. So you can remind them about the course elements in which you distinguished yourself, and that will normally be helpful. And then the second part of that equation is once you've opened that dialogue with your faculty member, the person who you are asking for that reference, don't hesitate to share a lot about yourself. Even if you are one of those introverted students who maybe don't feel comfortable, you really do have to get to a point where the referee has the capacity to be able to gauge your competencies, your research potential, and so on. So even if you didn't do that at the time that you interacted with them, you can do it subsequently and still get to the same point.
Okay, great. You mentioned in the presentation that some applications sink to the bottom because they're not that strong. What are the features of these kinds of applications? What are some common mistakes that our attendees could benefit from hearing?
Yeah, super question. Thanks for that. Here's what I strongly recommend against doing. There's a construct or a way in which people present their proposal that I think many of us find off-putting, and it's this sort of this evolution of you as a person. So you know this kind of story that starts that when I was 8, my mom took me to the city, and I was amazed by the buses there, and I became interested in public transportation, and like that narrative is honestly, it's tired, and you know, I strongly recommend against that. I think we have to stay more in the current to talk about the things that excite you. I can also say that the kinds of things that we pointed out earlier, a research proposal that doesn't feel like it's actually feasible sinks to the bottom. A research proposal that doesn't actually explain what you'll do sinks to the bottom. A research proposal that doesn't tell us why it's impactful sinks to the bottom. A research proposal that we can't understand at all. We can't make any linkages between what you're proposing and why we should be excited about the work that you're doing sinks to the bottom. a research proposal that is incredibly too dense for us to read, that is full of jargon and acronyms, and for the mathematicians and engineers in the group and the scientists in the group that are full of equations that don't mean anything to anyone outside of your discipline, that sinks to the bottom. So be careful on that balance again to getting us engaged and demonstrating your abilities without overwhelming us with the details. So I hope that's helpful.
Yep, that's great. Thanks, Jeff. Students who receive equity-based scholarships, although there is still some element of competitiveness, are they considered competitive enough to list on the application?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think if you've been awarded something in a competitive process, tell us about it, regardless of how deep the pool was or if there were a competitive advantage. You know, if I applied for, well, let me give you an example. I'll give you a facetious example, but I hope it gives some guidance. If I won an award at Waterloo for Americans living in Canada between age 50 and 55 who grew up in New England, and I was the only one in that pool and I won the award, wouldn't be very exciting. If I won an award that had a pool of 5 or 10 and it was really competitive, of course, that's more important. And if I won, again, a national or provincial award in an enormously deep pool. So it is helpful to be honest on your listing of awards about really how competitive something was. You know, so if you give us a sense of the pool and how you came to win the award, I think that's helpful. I mean, it's honest and it's refreshing.
Thank you. Does the status of your referee make a difference? So getting a reference from a dean versus from an assistant professor or a new faculty member?
Yeah, this might be a place where some colleagues might disagree with me. For me, there is a balance between having someone who is a well-established person in your field. If you were working on pulse lasers in physics and you got a reference letter from Donna Strickland, who is our Nobel laureate, that would carry more weight for me. That's only true if I got the sense when reading Donna's letter that she actually knew you. So maybe the right way to say it is this, Heidi. Getting references from high-profile referees is great, provided those high-profile referees are giving you a meaningful reference. There's a confidence that they actually know you and can assess your candidacy.
Okay, great. Just searching for a couple more questions here, Jeff. We're entering the home stretch of this wonderful presentation. While I look for a couple more questions to grab, is there any other comments you just want to make overall at this point? Yeah. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, thanks for that, Heidi. I think that there's one other point I'll make for our applicants. There's real value in going through this process, regardless of whether or not you're successful. Even if you start the process and for whatever reason you don't complete it, sitting down to think about what differentiates you amongst a pool of scholars who are competing for similar awards, it's always really helpful, and it's a time to reflect meaningfully on the things that you've accomplished. It can be really uplifting when you look back at all you've achieved. It can give you some direction about the places where you need to direct your attention if you want to be more competitive in a certain pool. It can certainly be useful for you to think through your research in a systematic and well-structured way. That derives enormous value. And maybe I'll just, again, share one more anecdote. When I finished my PhD, I had one really modest publication, and I had lots that was, I think, good on the teaching side, some community engagement. But when I got there, I mean, I really sat down and as I started to apply for jobs, which is, not dissimilar from applying for scholarships, it became abundantly clear to me that I needed to be able to beef up my my evidence of my contributions to my academic discipline. And that gave me some very good guidance for my first years as a faculty member. And ultimately, I think it helped me through the tenure process. So use this time as you're going through this application process as a time for self-reflection and to celebrate the things that you've been successful with and to give yourself direction on the places where you should direct your attention going forward.
That's great. Thanks, Jeff. So I just want to thank you very much. I think our questions have been dwindling. So if there are any questions that you've asked, audience, that you feel were not addressed or would like further information, please reach out to your department graduate coordinator or your graduate officer. I think Laura will put the links in the chat function so that you can access those. So again, reach out to them. They're very knowledgeable. They've been through these competitions many, many times. Again, this presentation has been recorded. We're going to be putting it up on our website. Again, Laura, if you could maybe add that link to the chat as well, that would be great. I would say it should be up by next week. We might just have to do a little bit of editing at the beginning of the presentation, given the technical difficulties we were having. So if you do have further administrative type questions, I know that there were several that came in the chat. So thanks, Laura and Elena, for addressing those. But if you have additional questions regarding the application process, how to fill in the application, or questions about what transcripts are required or how we evaluate your transcripts, those types of things, we will be having online chats tomorrow from 10 to 12, and then again on Thursday from 1 to 3. So feel free to enter your question into those chat functions, and we'll do our best to respond to you. Jeff, thank you so much. I think you did a great job. You always amaze me. You're just a wonderful, wonderful presenter and speaker. So thank you. I know our students will have found this very, very valuable. I always learn something from listening to you as well. So thank you. Audience, thank you so much for attending. And I really hope you have a great rest of your day. So thanks, everybody.
Bye for now, colleagues.